Hello friends, welcome to the Soviet journey. In this video, I will tell you about the fashion concept in the Soviet Union and the historical process of the fashion world. In general, Soviet fashion had differences from Western fashion. Although there were minor differences from time to time, the Soviets' fashion approach was always unique and contained many differences from Western fashion, as it was theoretically based on socialist philosophy. I would like to give you information about this subject. In the Soviet Union, the concept of fashion developed based on socialist philosophy and reached the masses. Unlike Western fashion, from its foundation until the 1950s, Soviet fashion was based on the working classes, and due to its collectivism and the principle of equality, it encouraged a functional fashion that did not aim to be superior to other people, as opposed to flashy clothing. Therefore, economical saving and practicality in clothing were extremely important. Then, after the Soviet Union won the victory over the Nazis in World War II, military-style clothing became popular among the Soviet people. This style of clothing was frequently preferred by Soviet citizens because it was both durable and reflected the principle of social equality. As of the Khrushchev period, Soviet fashion lost its originality and began to largely follow the general trends of the Western fashion world in terms of design. In Western fashion, individual clothing that aimed to make the person feel different from other people was prominent. These designs, which did not find a response in Soviet society, were frequently criticized by the public and the Communist Party, and it was emphasized that Soviet fashion should serve the working classes. In the Western world, fashion was seen as a consumer product of privileged people rather than meeting the basic needs of the people. For this reason, the number of different fashion designs that emerged in the Soviet Union is less than in Western countries, because fashion designs that would create differences between people were avoided. Soviet fashion designs have undergone many changes over historical periods, but despite this, the concept of new Soviet fashion has never been abandoned. Now let's watch the details about Soviet fashion according to the periods together. During the new economic policy period, the Soviet government allowed the entry and dissemination of Western fashion designs into the Soviet Union. However, the presentation of fashion based on capitalist consumption was opposed and revised in accordance with Marxist principles, because Western fashion of the period emphasized economic class differences. In the early 1920s, magazines such as Rabotnitsa, meaning worker woman, and Krestyanka, meaning peasant woman, began to include views on fashion. These magazines featured women in business suits in their early issues, but also featured advertisements for specific companies selling stylish clothing. From 1927 onwards, harsher articles began to be published against the fashion perception of the Western world. In these articles, the dominant view was that women should be evaluated according to the work they do, not their physical appearance. Because fashion, which was used as a beauty tool, contained bourgeois culture and was harmful to the socialist society that was being built in the Soviets. Instead of clothes representing the fashion of bourgeois culture, clothes that emphasized industrial materials and techniques and Soviet-style dresses based on the traditional clothes of the Soviet people were designed. Designers such as Varvara Stepanova and Alexander Rodchenko have said that fashion trends driven by the marketplace are harmful. During this period, geometric styles were used to design clothes that could be easily mass-produced and worn by both men and women. These clothes were called prozodeshta, which means production clothing, but due to the lack of materials and machinery in those years, they could not be sufficiently delivered to the public. After Stalin became General Secretary of the Communist Party, fashion magazines more strongly promoted the view that fashion and beauty were part of the needs of Soviet citizens. Rabotnitsa magazine began to feature fashion advice on almost every topic and regularly reported on new fashion houses opening in the Soviet Union. Krestyanka magazine also organized various trips to develop fashion. On November 17, 1935, Stalin held a meeting with workers from the Stakhanov movement which is a production and development movement, and spoke of life becoming better and more joyful. Interest in fashion developed among Soviet citizens with Stalin's words. It was emphasized that the ordinary and undiverse appearance of women during this period fed the capitalist views that socialism brings poverty. The clothes you see on the screen right now, in line with the fashion of the period, showed that the quality of life in the Soviet Union was at least as good as the quality of life under capitalism. For this reason, all Soviet workers, especially workers from the Stakhanov movement, began to wear stylish clothes when they went to factories. During World War II, the Soviet fashion industry was not interrupted and designs continued uninterrupted. During this period, Soviet citizens usually commissioned a special tailor if they wanted stylish clothing. During the war and post-war period, everyday fashion designs were often left to spontaneous production. Fashion magazines have begun to give advice to women, especially those who want to create their own looks. After Nikita Khrushchev became the General Secretary of the Communist Party, anti-Stalin propaganda increased in all areas and many of the previous policies were changed. This policy was also reflected in the field of fashion, and Western fashion representatives were given more representation in the Soviet Union. Journalists were sent to Western countries to report on the latest fashion designs. However, it was still opposed that the wild designs of Western fashion were replacing the classics that dominated Soviet fashion. It was particularly emphasized that the theme of modesty should be covered in clothing. For example, the designs of French modern designer Coco Chanel, which were unchanging over time and produced with simple symbols, were especially appreciated in the Soviet Union. New fashion designs have begun to be sold in sales stores called GUM, which resemble today's state-run shopping malls. The government's new approach to fashion during the Khrushchev era was carefully calculated. The Soviet fashion concept created during the Stalin era began to be abandoned, but even the products that existed in the old period continued to be difficult to reach the public. For this reason, no radical decisions were made, and old designs were tried to be slowly erased. Although the number of state-owned textile factories increased during the Khrushchev period, current fashion designs could not be produced sufficiently. However, the fashion industry has always continued to develop to a certain extent thanks to its standard modern designs and policies of rejection of radicalism. In an article in the New York Times in 1959, Soviet fashion was evaluated as an old formula of Western modern designs and was interpreted as clumsy copies. By the early 1960s, the appearance standards of Soviet citizens had risen. Street fashion in Moscow was almost the same as in a Western city. In the early 1960s, an independent fashion movement called Stylagi, which means style hunters, was formed among young people. This fashion style actually originated in America and was based on the classic looks people in the media at the time. While women's Stylagi fashion featured miniskirts and dresses with a childish attitude, men wore an aloha shirt, also known as a Hawaiian shirt, sunglasses, tight pants, and pointed shoes. This fashion approach was considered extreme by the fashion authorities of the period, and it was stated that this extreme culture represented bourgeois culture. By the late 1960s, most Soviet fashion organizations, including the All-Union House of Design, or ODMO, the central fashion organization of the Soviet Union, had increasingly begun to embrace new Western trends. During this period, many attempts were made to establish Soviet fashion. For example, the fashion of many shops was in a line that glorified the victories of Soviet science. Despite ODMO's new designs in the 1970s, Soviet industry was unable to meet the demand for fashionable clothing at the time, and the supply situation in Soviet stores became worse than in other socialist countries. During this period, there was a tendency among the public to be dissatisfied with the existing clothing. For example, some Soviet women's fashion authorities rejected designs that included Russian ethnic prints. This style became even more popular in the West than in the Soviet Union. During this period, people increasingly turned to Western style because the newly created Soviet fashion was not easily available. Blue jeans made in the USA were a particularly popular style of clothing. Clothes brought by Western tourists started to be sold at high profit rates in second-hand clothing stores. Western clothing was also sold in the state-run retail chain Beriodzka stores, but only those privileged enough to pay with foreign exchange certificates could afford it. Foreign exchange certificates and Western clothing are also available on the black market. Under the perestroika policies that emerged during the Gorbachev era, many Western fashion styles became acceptable. The Russian edition of the Berta style magazine, which emerged in West Germany in 1950 and was considered a representative of Western fashion, was allowed to be produced and imported into the Soviet Union in 1987. 1 year later, the modern tax-called journal Mod started broadcasting and started to spread this new fashion concept. Even though ODMO provided all the fashion designs in its content, it was almost indistinguishable from a Western fashion magazine. At the 19th Conference of the Communist Party in 1988, a decision was made to increase the production of consumer goods. In these consumer goods, the fashion of the clothes was specifically mentioned. Even though fashion was discussed in this high-level decision, there were no real changes in production. The Ministry of Light Industry set quotas for the production of new products, but textile factories continued to reproduce old patterns and products rather than new designs. As a result of the loosening of state control along with glasnost policies in the same period, Western elements came to the fore in fashion. Fashion designs were now being consumed as a status symbol, but it was still hard to get. Soviet fashion started its life as an anti-Western fashion, but in its last years before its dissolution, it turned into bourgeois culture. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was a boom in clothing imports from the USSR and Europe. Sequin dresses in different colors, black leather jackets, geometric outfits with triangle and zigzag prints became very popular in Boris Yeltsin's Russia in the mid-1990s. Yes, friends, in this video I wanted to give you information about Soviet fashion and the historical development of fashion in the Soviet Union. I hope you liked this documentary-style video and got some good information. I produce videos and documentaries on many little-known topics related to the Soviet Union and the world socialist movement. Don't forget to subscribe to our Soviet Journey channel and like our videos to follow and support us. I'm waiting for your comments below. Goodbye for now.